Well, hi everybody, and welcome back to the Ultimate Fashion History's FAVE Film Fashion. This time we're heading back to 1976 with Taxi Driver, directed by Martin Scorsese, starring Robert De Niro, Jodie Foster, Sybil Shepherd, and Harvey Keitel, with costumes by Ruth Morley. Now, Ruth Morley's name may not be as familiar to you as, I don't know, Edith Head or Ori Kelly, but it really should be, because also in the 70s, she created a look that would go on to become an international fashion trend that nearly every fashion-forward woman tried to buy into in one form or another. Yes, she created Diane Keaton's wardrobe for Annie Hall. A few years later, in the early 1980s, she also helped transform Dustin Hoffman into a passable woman in Tootsie. But today we're going to talk about Ruth Morley's absolutely iconic costume for Jodie Foster in Taxi Driver. And there it is, arguably one of the most instantly recognizable costumes in fashion history. Although when 13-year-old Jodie Foster first saw it and tried it on, she says she started crying. She hated it so much. But of course, it was absolutely perfect for her role as the 12-year-old prostitute Iris in the controversial Taxi Driver. The reason I want to talk about this particular outfit isn't only because I love it, because I do happen to love it, but because it's a great way to illustrate one of the challenges that I face every day as a teacher of fashion history. Okay, take a look at the outfit. It is so completely 70s, isn't it? Everything from the suedette wedge sandals up to the coral hot pants, the studded white belt, the polyester midriff, and of course that wonderful hat with the upturned brim. Also Jodie Foster's beauty look in the movie screams 1970s. The thin eyebrow, that smoky eye, thin lip, and that head of soft ringlets. Of course, it's completely 1970s, but something else is going on here too. This layering that we start to see from the late 1960s onwards of revival and nostalgia trends, because what Iris is wearing in this scene is actually a perfect example of what happened to the Deco Revival of the early 1970s by the time it hit the American mainstream. Okay, the Deco Revival actually started in the late 1960s in London with designers like Barbara Hulanicki and her Bieber label. I mean, take a look at this image here. Look at the hat, look at the ringlets. It's rather Taxi Driver, isn't it? But in fact, this predates it by, several years. Then in the early 1970s, 69, 70, 71, the Deco Revival trend peaked in Europe, and it was all based on 1930s glamour. Look at this image of Norma Shearer here from the 1930s with her soft ringlets, her bareback halter neck, and her big floppy hat. It's so 70s, but it's not. It's 30s. And yet the 70s embraced 1930s style. The 70s was a very bleak decade, as you probably know. It was not a very healthy or happy socio-economic or political landscape, and so people used trends in the 70s to escape. You could escape into Victoriana, you could escape into 1930s glamour, and that's what the Deco Revival was all about. In the very early 1970s, it really was a street style trend in Europe at the very trendy end of the spectrum, with only labels like Bieber and selected boutiques catering to it. But then in about 1972, it filtered upwards to become a high fashion look, and then it took no time at all for it to filter down to the mainstream in both garments and in makeup, but with no awareness at all that this was actually a 1930s revival. That's what happens in the trend cycle. By the time it hits the mainstream, people don't know what they're doing. They're just wearing it because it's out there and everybody else is wearing it. And this really speaks to the genius of Ruth Morley's vision for Iris, because by the time a teenage girl embraced the Deco Revival trend, it would be 75, 76, and with no awareness that this evoked the 1930s. And this is exactly what Jodie Foster is wearing in Taxi Driver, but also with other elements that were out there. A little bit of punk rock. Punk rock was just starting, and you see that reflected in the studded belt. What I love about this outfit too are the hot pants, because the hot pant craze was actually 1970 to 1971. That's when the really trendy kids wore hot pants. But again, the trend cycle being what it is, by the time it filtered down to a girl like Iris, I can't remember where her character was from, probably the Midwest somewhere. By the time it filtered down to a girl like Iris, it would be 75, 76. So I think this really speaks perfectly to how the trend cycle works, and so strongly to the Deco Revival. And nobody ever talks about that when they talk about the costumes in Taxi Driver. But herein lies the challenge that I face as a professor of fashion history. If you get something like this is Marc Jacobs, spring 2011. Some fashion writers said he was channeling the 30s. Others said he was channeling Bieber. Others just went straight for Taxi Driver. And you know what? They were all right. This is when things become complicated and so layered. It's no wonder my fashion history students get so confused. I'm always getting in trouble for grading too high. And forgive me, if I showed them on an exam this picture, but made it black and white, and then said, based on hair and beauty, name the decade, I wouldn't blame them if they wrote 1930s, because look, there is so little to distinguish between this Deco Revival of the 1970s and the actual beauty aesthetic of the 1930s. So fashion history and that layered nostalgia and trend cycles aside, there is something so completely, instantly recognizable about Jodie Foster's wardrobe in Taxi Driver that it's no wonder that fashion editors and celebrities and stylists channel it so often. It's instantly recognizable, but it doesn't look dated somehow, and perhaps that's because it didn't even date from the 70s to begin with. But so Ruth Morley created other really iconic looks in Taxi Driver, especially this one for Robert De Niro, and it'll come as no surprise to learn that yes, this has proven an inspiration for fashion as well, which is why I always tell my students to watch famous movies, watch classic movies, because you better believe it, fashion will harness them for inspiration. So I hope you enjoyed this week's foray into FAVE film fashion. You can email me through my website, amandahalley.com. Join our Facebook group, and I'll be back next week or sooner with some more FAVE film fashion. So to subscribe, just click the little circle that's appeared. And as always, thanks ever so much for watching. Bye for now.